Hello, welcome. This is NiCHE Conversations, and I'm Jessica DeWitt, one of the editors here at the network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am joined by Gianmarco Visconti. You want to tell us about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a writer from Edmonton. I was born and raised here in territory. In terms of my education, I'm a librarian and an urban planner, but I should add, I don't work professionally as a planner right now. So if I get some of my details wrong, that's why. But my framework is more as someone who studied planning and but was also interested in heritage conservation from a more historical and cultural perspective as well. But that's kind of me in a nutshell, I guess.
Cool. Yeah, I love that urban planning background, and that gives you have, I don't know, those little details of what brings us to these writings, and our different backgrounds you bring out so much of the urban planning in just this piece, right? So so the piece was The Winterburn Woodland, which was originally published with the Edmonton City as Museum project, correct? And I came across this on Instagram, actually, and I was like, ooh, this is great. And I think we need to cross-post this. So I reached out to you both, to the Edmonton City as Museum project, and you as well, to see if we could republish it. And we did. And today we're going to be chatting about it. So I wanted to start out by asking about Edmonton's ecology. So, because this is partially a post that's about Edmonton's landscape, right? So, what is the geographical zone on which the city was built, and how is this ecology unique in this zone?
Yeah, when you sent over some possible questions, I thought this was an interesting one to start with.
Yeah.
Because as I mentioned, I grew up in Edmonton. I think I always understood it to be a prairie, universally, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And when I studied planning and I got to take a course about ecology, and we were looking more about Alberta from a more regional perspective. You learn that there's all these different kinds of geographical zones that make up this large area. So Edmonton's in this eco-region that's called Aspen Parkland. And what makes it interesting is that it's a transitional zone. So I did my planning education in Calgary. So the farther south you go in Alberta, you get that more traditional Canadian grassland feeling where it's flat, ocean of shrubs and grass.
Yeah.
In Edmonton, it's Aspen Parkland is where this grassland transitions into mountainous regions in the west, and then kind of more into this boreal forest area in the north. So that's why I talk about how Edmonton's the landscape's a hybrid. It's sort of a patchwork. So it's not, I wouldn't say that it's more diverse, but maybe more explicitly varied in the kinds of things that you'll see. Of course, we have the deep river valley here in Edmonton, and there's areas. There are the grasslands. You get deep forests as well, sort of smaller patches of trees that kind of break up the grassland. So, and then of course the river itself. So you just see a lot of variation, and it's almost like a mosaic of different landscape features. That's the best way I can describe what Aspen Park. It totally shifted my understanding of what this area is, what is, in some ways, calling it, in common conversation, we tend to flatten what the landscape is, to say we're a prairie province or we're a winter city. But I think the specificity of Aspen Parkland is really interesting. Just kind of shifted my perspective on the place where I live and grew up.
Yeah, I live in Saskatoon, so technically we're also the Aspen Parkland, and I like that. I like how these different ways of thinking about the landscape, that makes it us connected, right? In a way that these provincial borders, etc., don't allow. Yeah, but I think before your piece, I never really thought about it in that way because I kind of like knew both of these places were in Aspen Parkland, but it really got me thinking about that. And I've been to Edmonton several times for research reasons, and just thinking, Edmonton feels a lot hillier, and yeah, the river is definitely like
Hmm.
much more like the ravine is much more. I'm seeking. What is the word I'm seeking? You know what I mean.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love that. I love this idea of thinking about the Aspen Parkland and anything to kind of break up those ideas of like the boring prairie and these stereotypes that are placed on our region of the world, right?
And you raised a really good point about how it's part of what makes this area specific, but also it's about connectivity with other places like Saskatoon or like the mountain areas, which are outside of maybe where you live, but there's like a
Yeah.
common connection. And I always appreciated that about regional planning is that it shows that conflict between what patches of land are actually connected through the land and
Mm-hmm.
kind of what physically we're able to do within that,
Yeah.
and how it's difficult to collaborate or to or it can be difficult to collaborate and make those connections through there. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's also about shifting the way that we see our borders and what we're able to how we think of ourselves connected to other people and other parts of the country, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that.
Hmm.
Um, so your piece is about a very specific place in
Hmm.
Edmonton. This is the title, the Winterburn Woodland. So I thought maybe we could move into talking, what is this place? What was this place?
Yeah, so the Winterburn Woodland was a tableland forest, which means that it was located kind of on the plateau above where the river valley is. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Today, if you look at it, it would be where sort of along the western boundary of Edmonton, so where the city boundary touches on NiCHE Cree Nation, kind of along. But there used to be, very rich, fairly large forest there, wetland, kind of forest and wetland area. Um, and then, but it was bulldozed in, I think, early 2000s, late 1990s, to make room for a suburban development called the Hamptons, which was a bigger western suburban project called the Grange. And first became attuned to the story out of research I was doing for eCamp already at the time about Edmonton's neighborhood histories, and I really wanted to grow out of the center because people already see the downtown core as
Yeah.
inherently historical. So let's talk about the history of the edge, I guess. Some of those places are close to being maybe 50 years old at this point, or we'll reach that point. So um, and I came across this article about there was a botanist in Edmonton who was advocating for the protection of this forest as part of I think the Edmonton Natural History Club at the time. So I actually interviewed her for my piece, Patsy Cotterill. So she was basically saying that, we need to conserve more of this forest and make sure that it's not destroyed in the process. But ultimately, most of it has been, at least the part that was within the Edmonton boundary, has been gone. I think part of it does lead into NiCHE Cree Nation, and I'm not quite certain how much is retained on that side. But in some ways it's kind of a conventional story, but I think what stood out to me is that there's if you read a lot of planning studies or geotechnical studies, oftentimes you'll see where it's like environmentally significant or environmentally sensitive, but it's kind of used in this very broad way of like, well, of course, it's a natural system, it has a natural function, and it's significant from that area. But there was kind of there's specific language used in this case. So the only piece of information I could find about the woodland was through newspaper articles from the mid to late 1990s, as well as this geotechnical study that was done by GeoWest at the time in 1993. And, they said they used language like, oh, it has unparalleled richness, or it's unparalleled tableland forest, and has this really unusual assemblage of plants that you don't really see elsewhere, and rich habitat for like birds and deer, and I think there were a pair of vulnerable bird species that made their home there. So to me, it seemed like, oh, this is actually kind of a unique place, because you don't want people talk about, or these studies talk about unparalleledness. So I think that kind of made it clearer to me what environmentally significant would mean in this case. But it seemed that it was surprising to me to learn that that wasn't enough to actually save most of it. And I think the people who are advocating for it were saying that I don't think their message was even that you can't build here, but it was, can we retain more for research, or we don't really understand what this is. So I think that was the main motivation behind my piece, because I had done some other stories for eCamp about places that were lost, where we know there was an important historical and cultural significance. Like there's Long Lake in Edmonton, or Kino-Kamau, which is now an industrial center, but that was the site of a Cree-speaking Métis community that was, contemporary of Fort Edmonton, and that completely displaced, and now it's just an industrial quarter, and the lake is pretty much gone. But people can trace their ancestry to that one settlement, and it's completely inaccessible. So I think in terms of thinking about that, I wanted to share the story about the Winterburn woodland, because I don't think we really understand what it was. And the thing with natural heritage is that it could have been there for hundreds or thousands of years. We don't know, right? And that's why in my story I tried to piece it or trace it back to David Truer's piece about the American National Park system, where his point is that whenever we see the reason why we try to preserve these unusually rich patches of land is because they were cared for and stewarded by people, indigenous people specifically. So I feel like it could have been maybe more examination of what this forest was and why was it so unusual. Now it's mostly gone at this point, but I wanted to try to just retain a small piece of what it was and share a short description of based on what I could find. So that's kind of the story of the Winterburn woodland in terms of what I find. I really hope that the story will maybe encourage more curiosity for those edge communities, and maybe some other patches of natural areas that are maybe partially still here. But I guess I'll leave it at that. But that's basically the story. It was this very apparently unique tableland forest, and it was, it seems like it was very clearly outlined that this is an important place or a special place, but it's pretty much gone at this point. So yeah, I hope that answered your question. I'm
Absolutely.
at this point.
I appreciate it also, like in your piece, how you point out how we focus so much on the river, and the same in Saskatoon. Like everything, when we think about naturalness, like everyone just focuses on the Meewasin Valley Authority and the river and the pretty trails along it, and we don't think about those habitats they're losing as suburban sprawl happens. We have our own Hamptons. We have our Hampton Village on the west side. Every city has to be exactly the same, right? And we have the Northwest Swale, which is a big ecological zone that they're trying to preserve here in Saskatoon, but the suburbs are as close as they can get to it.
Yeah.
It's like, but I think, just like it's so important for people to think about these other parts of the cities that aren't the river, and
there's, and it's not that the river valley is so dominant and it is so important that yes, all that attention, but it's not the only anything that contributes to the landscape, right?
Yeah.
And you made such a good point about how other places have their own Hamptons, right? So maybe I didn't even think about how this might connect to, growth in other cities, but I think it's a pretty common story. And sometimes we realize what's gone until we look back, right? So, I mean, even at the time in the 90s, the Winterburn area was already kind of degraded and fragmented. There was gravel activity, like there were industrial things happening already. So there was already an awareness that like, oh, it's already been degraded. So like, can we maybe hold off a little bit? But it happened over time, and then suddenly most of it was kind of bulldozed. So, but yeah, the thing is that once a forest is gone, like you can recover it maybe, but it won't be the same thing, right? So, and any evidence of human activity is gone, because one thing I'm interested in is how plants kind of mark the passage and activities of humans, right? So an example that's often given is that there are goji berries in the Edmonton River. Early days immigrants planted them there, and that's a record of that migration history. So, and if on, you wouldn't really have that story imprinted on the land, right? So, yeah, really, it's one of those things where we don't know what we might have missed, right? Maybe other people who are smarter than me can try to find more information about it.
Yeah. So we've kind of touched upon it, but is there like one main point you'd like to make about why the Winterburn woodland is important today, like this story?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I find it hard to talk about importance sometimes, because I can talk about why it's important to me personally, but I can speak for everyone. But I do feel like there's an inherent value to the mission of conservation on its own, because as much as we like to think that our lives in an urban center are totally unconnected to natural systems, that's not true. And that's part of why we have ecology as a field of study, is that yes, a deer grazing out there does actually impact what you do, right? In terms of having air, clean water, or not having your community flooded. And so all these things are interconnected. So I really feel like it's important from just a conservation side of like, how do we place value on environmental spaces? How do we actually understand significance and not just use it as a catch-all word for like, yeah, it's important, but is it significant enough to protect? So that's one side of it. The other side is, like I said, the sort of historical or cultural significance. Just in the same way that an old building retains history and memory, a really old forest also retains memory, right? And particularly, often particular to a specific community, right? So I think that it's important from that perspective, because I mean, I don't think we really know why. Maybe it's possible that it's just randomly grew in a way that was very unusual, but it's also likely that someone cared about that area and maybe designed it to grow in a certain way. So I wish that we knew more about that. And then the other side of it, I think, is that it's a story about our land use and spatial planning story, right? So I wonder now if this development was proposed today, would our decision have changed, as a city, right?
Yeah.
Would this, would the signaling done by this, community organization, as well as the study, would that have been enough to maybe signal that maybe we can design this development in a different way to not focus so much on the economic viability of protecting the area? But it's challenging, because I do understand, I guess, like, because if I put my planner hat on, I do understand that there are other pressures on suburban development in terms of affordability and things like that. There's a reason why we do build on the edge of cities, but some of it is just sprawl, right, for its sake, or some of it is just very short-term goals, like we just We know we can sell houses here and we want as much space to do that. But there is a limit to how much we can do that, right? So I do think it's important from that perspective to reflect on, can we continue to make these kinds of planning decisions, and when does that boundary become a hard boundary, right? Because eventually we won't have natural space, which again, going back to my first point, has a function that does benefit us. So
Yeah.
even if you even if you don't want to think of it that way, yeah, I would say that those are the three layers, I guess, of importance to me,
Yeah.
and hopefully that reaches almost everyone.
I really appreciate that thought exercise. Like, when does this end? Because, in North America, we're very, certainly in our lives and in our parents' lives probably as well, like, just, it's just been constant suburban growth, like, in sprawl, right? Like, it's just, that's what it is. Like, and, like, when does that end? Like, when does that end? It has to end at some point, I think.
Yeah.
We have to figure out something new. We gotta get some planners who are good at planning something else. So, other countries have other,
Yeah.
does, and yeah, the sometimes our space, I guess, is a problem that we're not forced into sizing down our city limits, right?
It's a really challenging question. I used to have a professor who would ask us, has planning made our communities better? And I don't know, like it's hard to answer that question, right? So I guess in other ways we do get caught in these patterns, right? And also I always struggle with the idea of, like, is land use bad or not? I don't think it is. I think we're just caught in maybe a specific way of land use that is more extractive. So it's also part of, like, is there another way to think about or conceptualize development in a way that maybe doesn't go constantly expanding outward, right? Because eventually we will hit a limit to how much we can do that. But yeah, it's a really challenging thought exercise.
Yeah, yeah. Whew, I love it.
Mhm.
Well, I guess we'll wrap it up there. I want to thank you for joining me today. I'm really glad that we connected,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
yeah, hope to see you on the internets again.
Likewise. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Marco. This is great.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.